Greetings, this is Chapter 4, Ethics in the Marketplace, and this is for Module 4 in GBA 383, Business and Society. So we're getting into now the ethics of competition and marketplaces. Specifically, we're going to look at perfect competition versus oligopoly versus pure monopoly. And you've heard me talk about oligopolies already in some of the previous lectures. So it is important to know the difference between the three of them and under what conditions ethics have an impact on the decision process. So our learning objectives are as follows. There's 5 of them for this chapter in this module. Number 1, we'll talk about how to apply ethics to market competition, specifically which of those 3 economic models follow which ethical perspectives and which one would be considered to be ethical, if at all. Number 2, we're going to outline the conditions that must be present to achieve perfect ethical competition. We're going to talk about, in the third goal, evaluating monopoly competition in terms of its ethical principles. And then the same thing as we differentiate between oligopolistic and monopolistic competition. Lastly, we'll interpret how public policy is developed in relationship to the effects of oligopoly. So how do we then make decisions at the government level to what to do given the impact and the ethics of oligopolies. So this chapter takes the perspective that the perfect competition is considered to be ethical under utilitarian philosophies and utilitarian perspectives. And everything is then evaluated against that assumption. So let's talk about some of the justifications that the book makes and the authors make about free markets. They allocate resources fairly in a way that's just, so that the distribution is just. The distribution is done in ways to maximize utility, economic utility for the society members, and they distribute the commodities in ways that respect the freedom of choice of both buyers and sellers. And so what it basically means is it's a free market that people can choose to buy or not buy, that they have options to choose from, and those options will enable each individual where they're at in the process to determine what the best utility is for themselves in terms of what product they want to buy. Some people, they want to buy more expensive products, and other people want to buy less expensive products. The focus then of this chapter is on how anti-competitive practices like oligopolies and pure monopolies should be addressed in terms of ethical norms. It looks at some of the underlying rationales for prohibiting anti-competitive practices, and it talks about the moral values that market competition is meant to achieve. Again, the goal of a perfect market is for perfect competition, for people to be able to do what they want to do, to buy and sell without any constraints. And this is wonderful in theory, absolutely wonderful. But in reality, it's just not how it works, because we have enlightened self-interest, individuals who are going to pursue what they want to pursue, profit for the sake of profit. They will dominate the market, and it becomes the problem for anybody who is trying to survive when A, you can't get the access to the resources because they're too expensive, and B, you're not making enough money to be able to afford it in the first place. So, in the second place, really. So there are some baseline assumptions in this textbook that free markets are the way to go, that they're the most ethical approach to things. But absent that, we've got to figure out how to make oligopolistic and monopolistic situations try to be as fair as they can be. And unfortunately, that's not always easy. So why do we care about anti-competitive practices? Well, the biggest issue that comes up in anti-competitive practices is the notion of price fixing. And what we mean by price fixing, as I'm sure you all learned in your basic economics classes, is that price fixing is focused on people controlling the prices and the availability of products that is not necessarily responsive to normal market supply and demand. They're actually superseding market supply and demand and setting prices, agreed upon prices, to increase the prices for consumers. So no matter who consumers go to, the prices are going to be abnormally high. And we saw this in a number of different industries. Your textbook does a really nice job on page 164 highlighting the four major areas where we've seen probably the most common areas of price fixing: in automobile industry, the publishing industry, shipping, and overseas shipping and things like that, as well as the real estate industry. And the thing that really shocks me, or maybe it doesn't shock me, it's still sort of surprising. It doesn't really shock me, but it's sort of surprising to see that in 2 years' time, over 60 major firms were prosecuted for anti-competitive practices, including price fixing. 60 firms in 2 years. So imagine how many more that are out there that are doing it. These are the ones that have gotten caught or at least have been prosecuted. And it's stunning to me that organizations would do this. It doesn't surprise me that they do it, but it's still stunning for me. I guess because maybe I believe that people should just allow the market to do what it needs to do. Price fixing is not capitalism. Capitalism is free markets, and that works. But price fixing, not so much. So the three basic economic models we're going to talk about are perfect competition, oligopolies, and pure monopolies. So in a perfect competition situation, everything is set up such that there's no buyer or seller has any more power than another. Everybody's got equal power. Everybody has goods and services to offer. And buyers can go in and buy whatever product or service that they want. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Then we look at what a monopoly is. A pure monopoly is one person controlling, or one organization controlling, all the products and services in a particular area. So that's why you see a lot of government agencies breaking up monopolies, because if one person controls the market, it's very difficult to have competition enter the market and compete and actually result in good products or services for people. Microsoft is a great example of a company that got pushed back because of their control over the marketplace with their Windows products and their Microsoft Word suite products and all those things. And they are the standard. Are they the best product out there? No. WordPerfect was a far superior product, but they behaved in a monopolistic manner and controlled the marketplace such that people were not able to get the right price for the products that they wanted. Esso or Exxon, Standard Oil was broken up because of monopoly. AT&T was broken up because of monopolies. So AT&T was broken up, and then we ended up getting regional Bells that had more control and more power, and AT&T no longer controlled the phone market. They became one of many. And that's why you see AT&T, Verizon, they're all different companies, all having a role to play in the telephone market. Oligopoly is where one or just a handful, a small handful, a minority handful are in control of the market in terms of pricing and offering products or services. So we'll talk more about what those are in a bit. This graphic is just from the textbook. It's figure 4.1, highlighting the three basic economic models that we've already talked about, and we're going to get into, obviously, in more detail. Perfect competition, oligopolies, where a handful of people or a handful of organizations control, and pure monopolies, where one person controls everything. So let's start with perfect competition. Perfect competition has 7 basic characteristics: that there are numerous buyers and sellers, that they enter in and exit the market freely. Nobody has more power or control over another. They're all equally out there, equally able to compete in the market, and they offer something that somebody wants, right? They have full and perfect knowledge of each other. There is similarity in their goods with some variations, of course. The buyers and the sellers bear the full responsibility of negotiating their deals and figuring out where their equilibrium point is for purchasing a product. There's no external regulation. Everything is between the buyers and sellers, and the goal for everybody is to maximize utility. Again, this is a perfect world. We know we don't live in a perfect world, but this would be a perfect world that we would want to see. That equilibrium point is where the buyers and sellers are all satisfied, and at the end of the day, I am selling products at the lowest rate that I could potentially sell it for, and still make good money, and the buyer is buying it at the highest possible point that they would want to buy without spending any more money than is necessary. And our goal, of course, is to figure out that equilibrium point. And it's different for everybody, and it's different for every product. So there isn't a consistent equilibrium point, only that it's the equilibrium point is where everybody's happy. Everybody is buying and selling at rates that make sense to them. So why do perfectly competitive markets achieve these three surprising moral outcomes? A kind of justice, a certain version of utilitarianism, and respect for moral rights. And really, perfectly competitive marketplaces mean that everybody is moving towards equilibrium, that it's fair to everybody, so it is just system. It has the utility that works for everybody. What I buy and sell for is different than what you're going to buy and sell for, so I will get the utility that matters to me. And it assumes that we're treating everybody the same, that we're providing a duty to meet their needs, and that is where the point of moral rights comes in, that universalism approach, the way that we treat everybody with kindness, we treat everybody with respect, and that's where the universalism comes in. So your perfectly competitive marketplace, while it might not have the ethics of care, probably should, because it's about maintaining relationships, there are at least three moral outcomes: the utilitarian approach, the justice approach, and the moral rights / universalism approach are all perfectly aligned with having a perfect competitive marketplace. So how do the mechanics of perfectly competitive markets work? Well, it depends on your demand curve, your supply curve, and where your equilibrium point is. I'm not going to get into deconstructing, supply and demand curves for you. You should have learned that already in your basic, economics classes. But in a quick overview is the demand curve is the line against which the consumers or buyers would be willing to pay for a unit of some product at different quantities. And so the demand curve is what I want at certain rates. So I want more when the price is lower, and I want less when the price is higher. So my demand curve is an inverse relationship. So when there is high price, there's less demand. And when there's low price, there's more demand. So it's an inverse curve. The supply curve is the line where producers decide how much they want to charge based on what the availability is of the product and how much demand, of course, is for the product. So I am willing to, because this is a positive relationship, lower levels, I'm willing to sell less, and higher levels, I'm willing to sell higher prices, I'm willing to sell more. So my point is, where does my curve from a demand perspective and to buy, and the manufacturer's curve in terms of supply, where they meet that satisfies both parties is that equilibrium point. So that the goal here is I want enough at the right price to satisfy my demand and my need as a buyer, and the marketplace organizations demand supply as a supplier, as the person selling the products. And the goal is that of course that equilibrium point changes based on all sorts of market conditions. Again, that's why you take intro to economics. I am not here to teach you economics, but this is giving us, making sure we're all on the same page, understanding what these terms are, because these influence when we think about what is considered to be fair or just or moral, and what that system should basically look like. So the more that we consume, the less satisfied we are with consumption. And so that's sort of this notion of marginal utility, that we really often get bored with what we're buying after a while. And the more that we consume it, the less satisfying it is. And either we choose to drop it and go to another product, or we feel like, we need more and more, depending on their perspective. On the other side, the supply and the principle of increasing marginal costs is, after a certain point, each additional unit the seller produces costs more to produce than the earlier units. And so again, there comes a point where it might be just too expensive to produce things at a certain level. And so we need to figure out where that sweet spot is for us, that equilibrium point, if you will. So why do price and quantities move to equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market? Well, when prices rise above equilibrium, surplus appears and drives the price down to the equilibrium. So if things are really high costs, we suddenly will see a surplus of things in the market because everybody wants to rush to sell at the high rate. And ultimately, with that surplus out there, it's not going to sell as quickly as we might like. And so the surplus disappears. As the surplus increases, the prices have to come down in order to be able to sell them. So that's why you'll see companies saying, we've got overstock, so we're lowering our prices to get rid of our stock. And the goal is that when we have too much stuff, we lower the price to get rid of it as quickly as possible, which cuts into our profit margin, of course, but nonetheless, it's how we have to manage it. When prices fall below equilibrium, a shortage happens. And when a shortage happens, the price goes up, because when there's not so many products out there, I can sell it for a higher price because, I can demand more for it. When quantity falls short of equilibrium, profits rise, right? So I have less quantity out there so my profit margin is going to increase. So it attracts sellers who increase the quantity to the equilibrium. So as I fall short of equilibrium, I'm making good profits, but because we're making good profits, more sellers enter the market, and that brings us back to that equilibrium point. When the quantity exceeds the equilibrium, the prices start to fall, profits will fall, and so the sellers leave. Why bother? I'm not making money. There's too many sellers in the market, and then that lowers the amount to that equilibrium point. So you can see how all sorts of things might occur. When we think about gas prices and the way gas prices have gone up and down in the last year, we can think about supply and demand in that context, right? Supply, there's a less of a supply because the Ukraine is not able to produce oil the way they were previously, or to get it out in the market. And with decreased supply, prices go up. And that's the way it goes. So what are the ethical considerations of a perfectly competitive market? Number one, a perfectly competitive market leads buyers and sellers to exchange the goods in a way that is just, that is fair for everybody. So that's what it said. They establish and sustain a capitalist form of justice. Supply and demand is done in a fair and just way. A perfectly competitive market leads buyers and sellers to allocate, to use and distribute their goods with more efficiency. When we are more efficient, we maximize our utility so that our costs are decreased. So we're more efficient in the way that we manage our costs so that our profit margin can increase and we can make more money that way. So we maximize our utility, because that's all profit margins are. They're your utility, right? Utility analysis. The perfectly competitive market brings these achievements in a way that respects buyers and sellers' rights of free consent. If I don't want to buy something, I don't need to. I'll find a seller out there that will meet my needs, and I have the right to leave this seller and buy from a different seller. So it creates this sense of fairness, for all involved. How are perfectly competitive markets perfectly ethical? Again, it's that capitalist form of justice. So it's fair to everybody. There is maximum utility for everybody involved, and it respects the negative rights of buyers and sellers so that we don't have to do something that we don't feel comfortable doing. Everybody gets free choice. What are some of the other implications or other ethical considerations of a perfectly competitive market? There is capitalistic justice, but it doesn't mean that there's other types of justice being addressed. So while we might consider it just in that there is fairness in the system from a capitalist perspective, there may be other injustices that we're not addressing. People who are not able to make money to be able to buy products and services, and maybe what they can afford is not what someone's willing to sell a product for. So they can't even compete in the supply and demand curve because they don't even have the money minimally to be able to buy something on that curve, right? By maximizes utility of market participants, they satisfy a certain view of utilitarianism. So it is only one perspective of utilitarianism. It doesn't address, all aspects of utilitarianism, but it certainly makes a good attempt at trying to maximize utility. There are some negative rights also that we should consider, in that, again, not everybody is going to be treated fairly in the system. Not everybody has that freedom to choose. They may have no options. There may not be competitors in their area where someone lives right now, and to be able to compete with that fairly. They can lead to a disregard of the demands of caring and value of human relationships. So when we approach the ethics of caring, there may be some aspects of perfect competition that doesn't really focus on the human aspect of things. It doesn't focus on human relationships and caring. It can encourage vices such as greed and self-serving and discourage virtues such as kindness and caring. So this is taking that virtue ethics perspective, and yes, it can. Again, a perfectly competitive market leaves ourselves wide open for organizations to engage in self-interest and self-serving decisions, so that not everybody is making the money that they want. And then lastly, they can be said to embody justice, utility, and rights only if the 7 defining features are present. So those 7 defining features that we addressed on the previous page have to be there in order for it to work.